and welcome back to Chris Story Studios. In case you missed last week's episode, things are really starting to get moving. You've been introduced to our main character, CJ, and his main struggle of really not knowing the difference between reality and something else. But as I hinted at last week, it's possible that problem's going to get quite a bit worse before it gets better. Let's tune back in to see where our characters are at. Hope you enjoy Chapter 3, Questioning Sanity. Out of all the places in Stafford Middle School, the lunchroom had to be one of CJ's least favorite. Between the perpetually sticky tile floor, the smell of burnt popcorn from the microwaves, and the drop-down ceiling that had several mystery stains on it, he would have hated being in here even if he didn't have to deal with other people. The crowd of students currently occupying almost every inch of the cafeteria made it all worse, though, and it felt like the air in the room was as crowded as the floor. Voices cascaded over one another in an endless throng that made it difficult to think straight. Still, CJ did his best to scan through the people sitting in the long rows of lunch tables. His gaze swept across the students quickly, in an attempt to avoid the odd, glowing outlines, though a couple students began exuding the imaginary light. He ignored it, glaring across the room as he finally found his quarry. Max wasn't too difficult to spot, even with some of the 8th graders in the room. His friend was among the tallest kids in the school. CJ finally found him seated by himself at the corner of one of the tables. Most of the kids who saw him in isolation opted to leave him there, and his harsh, stony gray glare likely helped them in that decision. If CJ didn't know him well, he might have thought the same as all the other kids, that Max was someone to avoid. He looked too big not to be a bully, and his resting face made him look angry all the time. That probably kept everyone else from realizing what a big softy hid underneath. Max would never hurt a fly, let alone another kid. CJ crossed the distance in silence, weaving through the small crowd of students while trying to keep his tray steady. His friend didn't notice him until CJ set his food down at the neighboring seat. "Hey man, you surviving?" Max asked around a mouthful of fries from the lunch line. The man's acting skills had improved. Max was probably waiting to hear about the result of his little joke since he stashed the note in CJ's locker. Well, the wait was over. "I was, although a little scare almost gave me a heart attack." "You think you're funny, don't you?" CJ asked as he pulled the envelope from his back pocket and slapped it onto the cafeteria table. The tone of frustration in his voice was mostly for dramatic effect, though some of it was genuine. Max really should have known better than to poke fun at CJ's hallucinations. It'd taken a lot of trust for CJ to share them with him at all, and he hadn't done so lightly. Max cocked his head to one side as he examined CJ. Then his gaze shifted to the letter, a puzzled expression remaining perfectly affixed to his face. Max's poker face really had gotten better. "What's this?" he asked. "A lot better." If CJ didn't already know, he might have thought his best friend was legitimately clueless. "I'll give you partial credit for finally pulling one over on me," CJ said, barely keeping a rein on his annoyance. "But you kinda crossed the line with this one. Not cool, bro." "CJ, I don't even know what this is," Max said, picking up the letter. He inspected the insignia for a moment, scowling before he turned the envelope over a couple times. CJ waited for the facade to fracture, for him to start grinning uncontrollably like he did every time he got caught. It never came. "Can I open it?" CJ nodded, though he could feel the scowl growing across his face. Max had to have written it. That was the only explanation. So why was a small speck of doubt starting to grow in the back of his mind? Max opened the envelope and tugged the note out. He peered at the loopy letters written on the stationery, then turned it over to see the other side. His puzzled expression remained as he twisted it over again. "Am I missing something?" Max asked, turning to him. CJ stared at his friend, examining Max's stony gray eyes. That was another odd thing about these hallucinations that had sprung up over the past few months. Everyone CJ came across, if he stared for long enough, would begin glowing. Everyone except Max. "Will you quit playing, man? You're starting to freak me out," CJ said, jutting a finger at the cursive letters. "You wrote this." He looked Max in the eyes, waiting for the mask to break. It didn't. Max's expression slowly shifted as his eyes leapt between CJ and the letter. What had started out puzzled now turned to concern. Those gray eyes of his suddenly seemed to harbor more worry than he'd like to admit. "CJ, this paper is blank." The words were spoken with such conviction that they stole whatever else CJ had in mind to say. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Blank? It couldn't be blank. CJ snatched the note out of Max's hand, pulling it close to his face as he examined it once more. The same 10 words that had freaked him out after first period were still there, plain as day. And yet, when he looked back at Max, that concern remained. And it looked genuine. CJ's eyes flickered back to where the paper trembled in his grasp. No, they have to be there, CJ said, his voice shaky as he stared at the words. Every loop, every speck of ink on that page looked as real as the person next to him. They didn't shift or shimmer like any mirage. They were just there, stagnant, solid. Or so he thought. CJ, there's nothing on the paper, Max said, laying a hand on his best friend's shoulder. CJ continued to stare at the page, at the words that looked so real, the same words that apparently weren't. Not again, CJ said, dropping the page onto the table and burying his face in his hands. The way Max had learned about CJ's hallucinations had been a similar instance, and half a dozen more had happened in the months after. But those had been different. It had been a pointy-eared man CJ saw out of the corner of his eye while walking down the street, or the silhouette of a person in the darkness that Max couldn't see. All of those examples had been at a distance, but this one had been close enough for him to touch. None of his previous episodes had been this bad, which meant only one thing. His condition was getting worse. The halos surrounding people and instances of reality shifting when he focused on it were getting more frequent, and as the letter now proved, more potent. How long would it be before he couldn't tell reality from fantasy? CJ pulled his head from his hands and shot a disdainful glare at the letter sitting on the cafeteria table. And as much as he hated to admit it, that time had already passed him by. I'm going crazy, he whispered, unable to pull his eyes from the note. Part of him hoped Max would offer a rebuttal, or that he would try to reassure CJ otherwise. Instead, Max merely squeezed his shoulder. Maybe we should revisit that idea of telling your mom, Max said, grimacing at CJ as if he already knew what the response would be. No way. Mom has enough on her plate without dealing with this, CJ muttered, covering his face in his hands once more. Even if he did tell her, what could she do? Suggest he go to the doctor? And how would they pay for that? His mom already had to work extra hours to cover everything since Dad was gone. No, CJ wouldn't add this burden to his mother as well. If it gets worse, we can think about telling her. That's what you said last time this happened, Max said, his eyes narrowing. Those gray stones seemed to bore into CJ's soul, searching for something. By the time he turned away, CJ wasn't sure if he found it or not. Max's gaze swept back to the letter, and his expression shifted once more. What do you see on the paper? Why does it matter? Apparently it isn't real, CJ replied. He suddenly felt the desire to rip both up and do his best to forget it. Humor me, Max said instead, pushing the note toward CJ. He buried his frustration as best he could and relayed the short, cryptic message. Max adopted a contemplative expression as he listened, and for a moment CJ thought his best friend was just acting, but when he finally spoke, the words sounded thoughtful. Tell no one about your visions. Does anyone else even know about your episodes? No. That's why I thought you wrote it, CJ said, feeling that same frustration bubbling back to the surface. Why was Max giving the note any more thought? It was apparently the product of CJ's own broken mind, nothing more. But I guess you didn't, since there's nothing there. I mean, I can't see anything at least, Max said, though his eyes lingered on the blank stationery. He looked like he was going to say something else, but then thought better of it. Still, those eyes of his remained on the papers as CJ snatched them off the table and stuffed them into his backpack. Just forget I said anything. It doesn't matter, CJ said. He wished it could be that easy, that putting the note out of sight could wipe it from his memory. But questions still surrounded the subject, try as CJ might to put all of it away. The stupid disappearing words were only one piece of this puzzle, leaving the envelope as another. Since Max apparently hadn't put the letter in his locker, that meant another mystery person had. In some ways, that made even less sense. Why put a fancy letter in his locker if there was nothing written on it? It does matter, Max replied, his eyes narrowing. CJ, you've been dealing with these things for months. I know you said they'd probably just go away on their own, but I don't think they will. I don't think you can ignore this anymore. As much as he hated to admit it, Max likely had a point. Ever since the first shimmering halo appeared, CJ had hoped that time enough would see them gone again, but it was becoming abundantly clear how foolish that notion was. Whatever had changed inside him seemed here to stay. The dreams had only gotten more vivid, and the hallucinations of the waking world were only feeling more solid each time they appeared. Maybe you're right. Maybe we should talk to my mom about it, CJ said as he rubbed his eyes once more. Part of him hoped that when he opened them again, he wouldn't catch even a glimpse of those shimmering outlines around people. Instead, a few of his classmates were already beginning to glow. But as CJ's gaze spanned the room, he found one person in particular. Johnny Lee was sitting 3 tables away, laughing with a couple of his buddies. No doubt at someone else's expense, he thought bitterly. Throughout CJ's life, he had experienced lots of things outside of his control. The most drastic example came when his father had been killed in a car accident when he was just 6 years old. Mitchell Blake's car had careened off the side of a beachfront cliff, breaking through the barricade into the Pacific Ocean's cold embrace. Echoes of that tragedy still clung to the Blake family, leaving both CJ and his brother Ryan without a father, and Emma Blake without a husband. But in a way, those dark moments had made CJ more resilient. He got knocked down a lot throughout the years, but he hadn't stayed down yet. Life could be cruel, and much of it was wildly outside of his control. But today, there was at least one thing he could do that was in his control. Tomorrow. We can worry about it tomorrow. Today, I have some long-awaited revenge to enact. Max looked like he wanted to continue pushing the point, but he seemed to think better of it. He merely nodded before going back to his food. Lunch ended soon after that, leaving the boys to go their separate ways. The classes after that seemed to blur in CJ's mind, and he felt like he drifted through them in a daze. His thoughts were either anchored to the odd note now stuffed into his backpack or the upcoming plot he hoped to enact. At least his final period would be in the science building. That was sort of what made the whole plan possible. When he had first heard that their science class would be taking place in a separate building far from the school, CJ had assumed this meant a lot of dangerous, outside experiments. That was not the case. It was separate from the school because the large structure used to be a shed that housed supplies. It was refurbished and outfitted for classes after an accident in the original lab area. Biology was the science class he took this year, which meant there were no cool lab experiments. The best they did was dissect things. Hopefully chemistry the following year would prove more exciting. But the building was good for at least one thing: pranks. It was close to 100 yards away from the main schoolyard. If the prank went wrong, there wasn't much that could be damaged, and he could safely set it up outside without anyone being the wiser. The fishing line for the tripwire would be too difficult to spot, and he could hide the fireworks in the tall grass. The pink powder from his homemade dive bomb would be a cinch to clean up, since he would just have to hose off the field after the fact. Johnny would get a new pink paint job, fireworks would blast straight up, and Stafford Middle School would end the year with a bang. It was going to be perfect. CJ walked slowly toward the building, lingering back in order to set up his trap before entering the classroom. He would have to be last, otherwise someone else would set the prank off early. Johnny was always the first person to leave the room, since he pushed past everyone else and stormed out. It was so predictable that CJ trusted the whole plan on that one detail. If anyone else stepped foot out of that classroom before Johnny did, it'd be a disaster. Kids sprinted by him, eager to reach and be done with the last class of the day. Soon the collection of kids slowed to a trickle. By the time CJ made it to the building, the door had been shut and only Max was behind him. "Ready?" his best friend asked. CJ nodded. He'd been more than ready to see this plan happen since they'd concocted it. "Is everyone inside already?" "I think so," Max said, looking back at the main school structure. The field around them was empty. So, unless a student was really late, they were the last ones here. "Perfect. Go on ahead and I'll set it up. Cover for me if you have to." Max nodded and walked into the building. CJ stooped before the door and began setting the trap. It took a couple more minutes than he would have hoped, but he didn't think anyone would be too suspicious by the time he stood up and entered the building. He was careful to step over the tripwire he'd placed at about shin height. Now, it was just a waiting game. Welcome back.
He just looked at me.
Dang. Did I seriously look straight at you, not the camera?
You looked in my eyes.
Oh my gosh.
I don't exist, homie.
You also are a figment of my imagination. It's not just CJ who can't tell the difference between real and fake anymore. I'm just losing my mind over here. This isn't even your house. I just broke into some random couple's house. Sorry. Anyway.
Why are you admitting that on tape?
I'll cut it. That'll be fine. Welcome back. So it turns out Max didn't write the letter after all. Who could have seen that coming? I'm sure half of you guys did. It's not the biggest plot twist, but things are about to get a whole lot more interesting, I promise you. If you're intrigued, great. If you're getting a little bored, come back one last week. I promise I will have you hooked. Anyway, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this last episode, and come back next week for Chapter 4, Broken Minds and Bloody Knives. Until then, I hope you have a great rest of your week, and enjoy the rest of your day. See you later. Enjoy your next 24 hours. I'm done.
Just got debated, boy.
Get debated. Got him. All right. I think that was it. I think we're good. I think we're golden.
You don't want me to keep rolling and just get you like 400 gigabytes of footage?
No, I'm good.